There is a moment in a relationship with a narcissist that is very hard to name. It does not happen when you uncover a specific lie, nor does it lie in the moment you decide to leave or stay. It happens far more quietly at the point when you no longer need to understand them. Not because you have understood everything, but because you are no longer asking questions with the same old motivation. You are still there, still physically present, still talking, still sharing a familiar space, but something has withdrawn. No one can see it. No one can point to it. But they know. A narcissist always knows when the flow of energy that once sustained them is no longer moving the way it used to. Before, every reaction of yours, confusion, hurt, the effort to explain, the effort to repair, served as proof to them that the system was still operating, that they were still the center, still held the power to regulate emotions, still had a role in your inner life. But at some point, often after you have endured long enough, questioned enough, and grown tired of having to prove that you are not crazy, not overly sensitive, not asking for too much, you stop. Not with a declaration, but with a subtle withdrawal of the mind. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer hurt to be acknowledged. You no longer react to keep the relationship's pulse going. And it is precisely at that moment that the narcissist knows you have seen through them. Not because you speak the truth out loud, but because you no longer behave like someone who does not know the truth. A kind of emptiness appears in the way you are present, not coldness, but detachment. You do not disappear, but you are no longer in the old role. From the perspective of Carl Jung's depth psychology, this is a critically important moment. Libido, the flow of psychic energy, has withdrawn from the object. When that happens, the narcissist's false self loses its external support. They are no longer being mirrored in the way they require. And for a personality structure that lives by reflection, this is not an emotional loss, it is an existential threat. A narcissist does not truly fear being exposed to the world. What they fear far more is that you no longer participate in the false reality they need in order to survive. When you no longer need their validation, no longer need their apology, no longer need them to change so that you can keep staying, power has shifted. Quietly, without a declaration of war, but irreversibly. They feel this shift like a voltage drop in the system, a room that was once fully powered, suddenly turning cold. No explosion, no alarm, just a silence they cannot control. From this moment on, every behavior of the narcissist, anger, counterfeit pity, coldness, accusations, avoidance, or smear campaigns, is not random. They are desperate attempts to restore a system that has lost its function. And in this video, we will not treat them as isolated tactics. We will look at them as the inevitable stages of a psychological structure collapsing when the shadow is no longer shielded by the persona. If you are watching this video, it is very likely you are standing at that exact crossroads where you no longer want to argue over right and wrong, no longer want to win, and no longer want to be loved in the old way. You simply want to return to yourself without carrying any role at all. And if that is true, then their reaction is not a sign that you have done something wrong. It is the clearest evidence that you have stepped outside the system of control, and that truth, even unspoken, has begun to operate on its own. Part 1. The collapse of energy. The first thing that collapses when you see through a narcissist is not the relationship itself, nor trust, nor emotion. What collapses first is the invisible flow of energy that kept the entire system running. For a very long time, possibly for years, you were not just a lover, a partner, or a companion. You were the place where their emotions were regulated, the surface onto which they projected themselves in order to feel that they existed, the space where they unloaded what they could not carry on their own: anxiety, shame, emptiness, and the fear of being meaningless. You were never named as such, but you were occupying that role. For a narcissist, a relationship is not built on mutual attachment, but on a one-way flow of psychological energy. Your confusion made them feel powerful, Your tears confirmed that they were still the center. Your efforts to explain, to fix things, to make everything better, were proof that the system was still functioning. The more you suffered, the more stable they felt. The more you tried to understand them, the less they had to understand themselves. But then there comes a moment very often after you have asked enough questions without receiving real answers, after you have explained yourself enough times only to see everything return to the same point when you become tired. Not the kind of tiredness that makes you want to leave immediately, but a deeper kind, tired of the role you have been holding. You begin to fall silent in a different way. No longer a silence that waits for them to change, but a silence that comes from no longer having the energy to keep investing in the same loop. And it is here that the energy begins to withdraw. From the outside, no one may notice this change. You do not explode. You do not rebel. You do not declare that you are leaving. But at a deeper level, something very important has happened. Your psychological libido has withdrawn from the object. You no longer attach your emotions to their reactions. You no longer need their response to confirm that what you feel is real. You no longer live in a state of waiting, waiting for an apology, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for the moment when they finally understand. And the narcissist senses this almost immediately, not through reason, but through the body, through a sudden sense of absence, as if a room that once had electricity has abruptly gone cold. They try to reach you in the old ways, a provocation, a challenging look, a remark that once hurt you. But this time, no current turns on, no emotion surges, no familiar reaction appears for them to hold on to. There is only a silence that no longer carries expectation. For the narcissist, this is the first moment of panic, even if they cannot yet name it, because their entire ego structure is not built from within, but relies on regulation from the outside. When you stop providing that, their false self is no longer anchored to reality. They are still standing there, still speaking, still behaving as before, but deep inside a crack has appeared. Not because you left them, but because you are no longer present in the way they need. What is important to understand here is this. The narcissist does not realize that you have seen through them in an intellectual sense. They do not sit down and conclude that you now understand narcissistic pathology or manipulative mechanisms. They know because you no longer perform the regulating role for them. You no longer absorb emotions on their behalf. You no longer carry shame for them. You no longer keep the system stable at the cost of your own depletion. And when that role disappears, the relationship in reality has already ended, even if the external form still appears intact. From this moment on, every subsequent behavior of the narcissist is not aimed at connection. It is aimed at restoring the lost flow of energy. But what they have not realized and will not accept is a very simple truth, that energy cannot be taken back through force. Because what has withdrawn is not love, but your psychological participation. And when a person has withdrawn from a role, no tactic can return them to that position without completely destroying the structure. This is the true beginning of the collapse. Quiet, undramatic, and irreversible. Part 2. The shift in the gaze. After the flow of energy withdraws, the next thing that changes is not behavior, but the gaze. This is where the narcissist begins to know not through reasoning, but through instinct. There is a very subtle moment when they look at you and realize that what they once saw there is no longer present. Before, your eyes always carried a kind of searching for answers, for validation, for a sign that you were not imagining things. Even when you were angry or hurt, there was still a movement toward them in your gaze, and it was precisely that movement toward them that allowed them to continue existing as the center. But now, that gaze changes. It does not become cold, nor does it become hostile. It becomes still. A stillness that leaves the other person with nothing to cling to. You no longer look at them as a puzzle to be solved, nor as a source of hope. You begin to look at them as a phenomenon not in order to judge, but to observe. And for the narcissist, this is a deeply frightening moment, because for the first time, they are no longer being seen through their persona. They realize that you are no longer interacting with the image they are performing. You no longer respond to their confidence, their hypocrisy, or their victim narrative in the old way. Your gaze no longer buys what they are selling, and it is precisely in that moment that the narcissist feels seen through, not understood, but exposed. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the persona is pierced. The mask that once mediated between them and the world is no longer being reflected back. And when the persona loses its function, the shadow is immediately pushed to the surface. This does not happen as a dramatic revelation, but as a deep internal sense of nakedness, a feeling of having no skin. They begin to feel that you no longer see them as a person with a credible story, but as a structure trembling to hold its shape. During this phase, the narcissist will look back at you for a long time, not with the gaze of a lover, nor with the gaze of someone who is angry. It is the gaze of someone assessing a threat. They try to find in your eyes traces of the familiar confusion, the old hope, the need to be understood. But they find nothing except detached presence. And it is precisely this detachment that terrifies them more than any accusation ever could. Because when you look at a narcissist without needing them to be anyone, they no longer know who they are. What matters is this: you do not need to intentionally look this way. This gaze is not a tactic. It emerges naturally when you are no longer emotionally invested in the outcome, when you no longer hope they will change and no longer need them to collapse. You are simply seeing reality as it is, and reality, for a structure that survives on illusion, has a destructive effect. At this stage, the narcissist begins to sense that the spell has broken, not because you are stronger, but because you are no longer pulled into the role. The idol within them begins to crack, because a God exists only as long as someone believes. When your gaze no longer reflects that belief, they do not just lose power, they lose their sense of reality itself. And this is the crucial point that many empaths fail to recognize. The narcissist is not angry because you see them as bad. They are angry because you see them exactly as they are, without exaggeration, without idealization, without concealment. Your neutral observation strips away their most powerful tool of manipulation, the ability to shape another person's emotional reality. From this moment on, the relationship enters a new phase. No longer push and pull, no longer love and hate. It becomes a desperate effort on the narcissist's part to break your state of observation. Because if they cannot pull you back into a reactive position, the entire structure they live by will continue to slide. And that is when their behavior begins to turn chaotic. Not because they have lost control, but because the old tools no longer work. Part 3. Manipulative chaos. When your gaze no longer reflects, the narcissist does not stand still and accept it. On the contrary, this is when they begin to move the most. But this is not the movement of someone trying to connect. It is the movement of a system losing control. Inside them, a very specific sensation begins to form. The feeling that something which once operated smoothly is suddenly no longer responding to commands. And for a personality structure that lives by controlling other people's reactions, this is an intolerable state. They cannot name this feeling, but their body knows, their mind knows, and the response appears almost immediately. They try everything, not in sequence, not logically, not according to any clear strategy, but as a rapid series of behaviors, each aimed at one single goal: to make you react again. You will see them change very quickly over a short period of time. It may be within a few hours. It may be within the same day. At one moment they are angry. explosive, saying sharp words meant to strike your old wounds. The next moment they collapse, cry, speak about their childhood, their pain, how misunderstood they have been. Then immediately after that, they become cold and distant, as if you mean nothing at all. And if none of that pulls you back into the old role, they may suddenly become sweet, charming, intimate, as if nothing had ever happened. What is important to understand is this: these are not genuine emotional contradictions. These are tools being pulled out in rapid succession when the control panel no longer responds. The narcissist is not emotionally dysregulated in the usual sense. They are checking which button still works: the fear button, the guilt button, the compassion button, the hope button, the button that makes you defend yourself, explain yourself, speak up. Because as long as you react, even if that reaction is self-defense, the system has electricity again. But this time, nothing turns on. You stand there and observe, not with defiance, not with contempt, but with a detached presence that has been established from within. And that, more than anything, is what panics the narcissist. Because they can no longer read you. They do not know which behavior is touching you. They do not know which tactic is still effective. They begin to feel like an actor constantly changing costumes in front of an audience that has already left the theater. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the persona completely loses its regulatory function. The mask that once helped them adapt to each situation no longer receives feedback from the outside, and so it begins to slip out of place. The shadow, the raw part, the desperate part, the unintegrated part starts to leak through every behavior, not in the form of confession, but in the form of chaos. And this is something many empaths do not realize. If you see the narcissist becoming unhinged, incomprehensible, or erratic during this phase, it is not because you have driven them mad. It is because you have stopped holding their structure together. For a long time, it was your reactions that unknowingly performed that function. When that function ends, the system begins to collide with itself. You may feel confused witnessing this. A part of you may still want to understand them, to help them, to believe that if you say the right thing, they will stop. But the truth is, at this stage, no words can fix the situation. Because the problem does not lie in communication. It lies in the disappearance of the regulatory supply. And when the narcissist realizes that no button works anymore, that you are no longer pulled into any familiar role, a very dangerous awareness begins to form within them. If control cannot be restored, they must change tactics at a deeper level. No more testing, no more probing, but a shift into a state of defense and attack at the same time. From this point on, their behavior is no longer aimed at pulling you back. It begins to aim at protecting a cracking false self. And that is when something else appears no longer chaotic, but cold, sharp, and exposed. Part 4. When the mask falls. After the phase of chaos, a very strange moment occurs. Not an explosion, not an outburst of rage, but a sudden settling. As if the narcissist has realized something very specific. There is nothing left to try. No buttons still work. No role can pull you back. And when that realization arrives, they stop performing. This is when the mask falls. Not in a dramatic way, but in a bare, exposed one. They no longer try to appear kind, no longer maintain the small everyday courtesies, no longer uphold the minimal reasonableness that once made you doubt yourself. Their face changes noticeably, not because they are trying to show anything, but because the facial muscles no longer need to strain to hold the persona in place. The eyes become flat, cold, and there is an unhidden contempt. Many empaths are shocked at this stage, because they still carry a silent assumption that no matter how hurtful the other person has been, at least they are still human. But what you are seeing now is not a worse version of them. It is the version that no longer needs to pretend to be human for you, because in their mind, You are no longer the audience. You have left the theater. From this point on, the way they treat you changes completely. No more attempts to understand. No more attempts to explain. No more effort to connect, even in distorted ways. You begin to be treated like an object that has stopped functioning, something that once had use value, but no longer performs its function. And for a structure that lives by utility, what no longer works is removed from the category of worthy of respect. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the shadow takes over the entire stage. The persona, the social mask that once helped them maintain an image, no longer has any reason to exist when you no longer believe in it. And the shadow, unintegrated, without regulatory capacity, without an internal moral compass, appears exactly as it is, cold, empty, and detached from consequence. What makes this phase frightening is not overt violence, but the absence of any humanizing effort. They do not need you to understand. They do not need you to hurt. They do not need you to react. They only need you to know one thing. You have crossed beyond the permitted boundary, and this coldness is the punishment. You may feel as if you are living beside a stranger, someone you once believed had depth, emotions, the capacity to love. But what you are facing now is a structure with no remaining motivation to maintain illusion. Not because they have changed, but because you no longer need the illusion. And when an illusion no longer has an audience, it collapses on its own. It is very important to state clearly here, the mask does not fall because you confront them. It falls because you no longer participate, no longer hoping to repair things, no longer trying to save the relationship, no longer questioning whether you are too sensitive. Your psychological withdrawal has done what hundreds of arguments never could. It has removed the persona's reason for existence. And when that happens, the narcissist begins to enter a different state, not chaos anymore, but cold defense. No more emotional testing, but position fortifying. No more pulling you back, but preparing for the possibility that you may become a long-term threat. From here on, the story no longer revolves around the relationship. It revolves around the survival of the false self. And to protect it, the narcissist is willing to enter an entirely different mode. Part 5, Paranoia, Bunkermode, Paranoia, Bunkermode. After the mask falls, the narcissist no longer focuses on pulling you back. Another preoccupation begins to occupy their mind, deeper, colder, and survival-based. They start to see you no longer as someone once close, but as a latent threat. Not because you are threatening them through any concrete action, but because your clear-sighted presence has done something very dangerous. It has shattered the illusion of control they need in order to exist. At this stage, the narcissist enters a particular form of paranoia, not the kind that loses touch with reality, but a state of hypervigilance, as if they are being watched. They begin to believe that because you have seen through them, you will inevitably do what they themselves have done, manipulate, reverse the narrative, destroy their image, and gain the upper hand. This is where projection operates at its absolute level. They assign to you intentions they understand very well, because that is how they themselves view the world. From the outside, the initial changes may seem very small. They place their phone face down. They carry it with them even into the bathroom. They change the passwords to accounts you once shared without any explanation. Money begins to be moved. Calls take place in spaces where you cannot hear. Voices lower behind closed doors. The atmosphere in the home changes not into emotional tension, but into deliberate secrecy. What is important is this. They do not do these things because of anything you have done. They do them because of what you have not done. You do not confront them. You do not interrogate. You do not react. And it is precisely this calmness that makes your intentions unreadable to them. For a structure that always needs to control information and emotion, not being able to predict what the other person is thinking is intolerable. And so they begin to defend themselves as if war were imminent. The shared home? in their mind is no longer a place of refuge. It becomes a battlefield. Not because there is open conflict, but because they believe the truth is occupying the same space as they are. Every step you take, every silence, every ordinary action can be interpreted as a threat. They begin to gather, conceal, and shield, not to protect you from them, but to protect the false self from the possibility of exposure. At this stage, the narcissist often becomes more rigid and controlling in details that seem trivial. Rules change. Boundaries are imposed unilaterally. Your privacy is invaded while theirs becomes untouchable. Everything carries an implicit message. You are no longer trusted, no longer given access, no longer considered to be on the same side. And here lies the paradox. The less you do, the more their paranoia intensifies, because you are not reacting according to the familiar script. You are not proving yourself harmless, nor are you attacking in a way that would confirm an enemy role. You are simply present in your own truth, and that leaves them with nothing to grasp in order to locate reality. From a depth psychology perspective, this is the point at which the narcissist begins to imprison themselves. Not because you isolate them, but because they cannot exist in a space where they do not control the image. They retreat into a smaller world where information is controlled, where the story is rewritten, where they can continue to believe that they are the threatened victim. But bunker mode is not the end. It is only a preparatory stage. Because once the narcissist has convinced themselves that you are the enemy, the next step becomes unavoidable. They must reverse the roles. They must turn you into the villain, not only in the eyes of others, but within your own mind. And that is when the most dangerous form of projection begins. Part 6. The final projection. When they call you a narcissist. When the narcissist has placed themselves in a state of war, when they have come to believe that you are an existential threat, the next step becomes unavoidable, not direct confrontation, not confession or withdrawal, but role reversal. This is where projection reaches its most refined and cruel form. They begin to call you the narcissist. This moment often arrives cold. No more emotional chaos, no more tears, no more explosive anger. Just an accusation delivered with certainty, almost with moral authority. They look at you and say that you are controlling, that you manipulate, that you are cold, that you are abusive. And what makes this especially damaging is not the content, but the language they use. These are no longer the vague accusations of before. They use the very concepts you have learned in order to save themselves. Gaslighting, abuse, empathy, trauma, narcissism. This is not coincidence. This is a deliberate act. When the narcissist knows that you have seen through their structure, they understand one thing very clearly. If you maintain your clarity, they will have nowhere left to hide. So they do not target your behavior. They target your perception of yourself. If they can make you doubt your identity, doubt your motives, doubt whether perhaps you are the problem, then they do not need to win. They only need to make you stop. And this is the point at which many empaths collapse, because you are not someone who has never self-reflected. You are accustomed to examining yourself. You are used to asking whether you are too sensitive, whether you ask for too much, whether you did something wrong. The narcissist knows this. They know that your self-awareness, once your strength, can be turned into a weapon against you. And so they plant a highly toxic seed. What if the other person is right and I am the narcissist? From a depth psychology perspective, this is the moment when the shadow is violently cast outward. The narcissist cannot tolerate seeing their own darkness, so they place it onto you. Not because you are like them, but because you are the only one close enough for them to do it. And when you begin to question whether the accusation might be true, they have achieved their first objective, pulling you away from your clarity. But there is a crucial detail you must see clearly at this stage. A narcissist never calls you a narcissist while they still control you. They do it only when you have already broken free. This accusation is not a diagnosis. It is a survival reflex. It appears when every other tactic has failed, when they have no remaining way to hold power except by distorting reality. And if you look closely, you will notice a striking paradox. They cannot tolerate your silence, but they also cannot tolerate your voice. They do not want you to react, but they also do not want you to stand firm. Because any state in which you no longer revolve around them is a threat. So they try to pull you into an endless loop of self-doubt, where you are so busy analyzing yourself that you no longer have the energy to face the truth of what is happening. This is the stage at which many empaths believe they are losing their way, no longer being themselves. But the truth is this: you are not losing your way. You are standing at the edge of a very important separation. And the narcissist senses it. They know that if you maintain your clarity long enough, they will lose all access, no access to your emotions, no access to your perception, and no access to your story. From this moment on, one thing becomes very clear. The narcissist no longer wants to be near you, not because they are at peace, but because your presence has become intolerable. No longer a battle of words, no longer subtle control, but an almost biological reaction, a need to keep distance. And that is when another sign appears, colder, quieter, but unmistakable. Part 7, Physical Avoidance, when truth becomes unbearable. After projection no longer works, after role reversal fails to pull you back into the loop of self-doubt they hoped for, something very clear begins to happen. The narcissist can no longer tolerate your presence. Not because you speak too much, but because you no longer speak in the way they need. Not because you provoke them, but because you exist in a state they cannot manipulate. This change does not happen through words. It happens through the body. You enter a room, they leave it. You sit down, they stand up. You appear in a shared space, and they immediately find a reason to go elsewhere. Not with overt anger, but with a deeply instinctive recoil, as if being near you makes it hard for them to breathe. Many empaths describe this sensation in remarkably similar terms. The air suddenly feels heavy, cold, and hollow, as if something unspoken is being actively avoided. What is important to understand is this: this is not ordinary avoidance. This is not sulking, a cold war, or a need for personal space. This is a survival response. When you no longer participate in the illusion, when you no longer reflect the persona, your presence becomes a living reminder of a truth the narcissist cannot face. And for a structure that survives through denial, truth is not merely uncomfortable, it is a threat to existence. At this stage, many narcissists experience a kind of nameless dread, not fear of you, but fear of the raw exposure that arises within them when they are near you. You do nothing. You do not stare. You do not interrogate. But you are there, in your clarity. And that clarity prevents them from continuing to believe the story they tell themselves. You become a mirror they cannot turn away from fast enough. Not because you verbally reflect their shadow, but because you no longer shield it. Before, your reactions, anger, pain, pleading unintentionally helped them avoid their darkness. Now, without that cover, the shadow stands exposed in the open, and the only remaining reflex is to flee. This is the phase in which narcissists often begin to disappear from everyday moments. No more shared meals, no more casual conversation, no more natural presence. Every interaction becomes functional, brief, and cold. They do not want to remain in the same space with you any longer than necessary, because every second near you forces them to feel an inner instability they can no longer blame on anyone else. And here lies a deep paradox. The narcissist may say they do not care, that you no longer affect them. But if that were true, they would not need to avoid you so intensely. This avoidance is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of helplessness. When they cannot manipulate you, cannot break you, cannot pull you back into any familiar role, the only way left to protect the false self is to create physical distance. At this stage, many empaths begin to feel a very strange quiet, not complete relief, but a kind of clarity. You realize that you are no longer being pulled into invisible conflicts, no longer absorbed into emotional states that are not yours, no longer adjusting your breathing to someone else's instability. You begin to feel your own body again, your own space, your own rhythm of life. And that makes the narcissist retreat even further, because your calm is not something they can compete with. They can argue, they can attack, they can smear, but they cannot exist for long in a space where there is no reaction to extract. Truth does not need to be spoken. It operates through presence alone. And near you, they have nowhere left to hide from it. But narcissists rarely accept retreat in silence. When physical avoidance is no longer enough to make them feel safe, when truth continues to exist, even if they refuse to look at it, a final step often occurs cold, calculated, and socially destructive. This is when they no longer avoid you. They begin to shape how others see you, and that is the final stage in this chain of reactions. When looking back at this entire chain of reactions from the collapse of energy, the shift in the gaze, chaotic behavior, the falling of the mask, paranoia, projection, avoidance, and finally the smear campaign, there is one crucial point that needs to be placed back in its proper position. This story was never about whether the narcissist recognizes their mistakes, nor is it about whether they feel remorse, experience pain, or what kind of person they ultimately become. All of that belongs to their inner life, and it will continue to operate within limits they have never crossed. What truly matters is what has changed in you. The moment you see through them is not the moment you become stronger in the conventional sense. It is the moment you stop participating in a structure that has no capacity to support truth. You do not defeat them. You do not overcome them. You simply withdraw from a role that has been silently draining you. And that act, seemingly very small, collapses the entire system of power they live by. Many empaths still carry a quiet question. Why do they react so violently when I did nothing at all? The answer lies right there. You do not need to do anything, because what is being threatened is not the relationship, but the illusion of control. When you no longer need them to validate your reality, they lose power. And the loss of power in a personality structure that survives on power is experienced as collapse. If there's one thing to hold on to after all these analyses, it is this. Their reaction is not evidence that you were wrong. It is evidence that you saw correctly. Coldness, paranoia, projection, and smearing do not appear when they still control you. They appear only when you have stepped outside the system, when you no longer react to feed the illusion, when you no longer need to be understood in order to exist. And perhaps at this point, you do not feel a sense of victory. You simply feel empty, quiet, and slightly strange. That is not loss. It is the necessary space for you to return to yourself, a space where you no longer have to carry emotions for someone else, no longer have to keep a distorted structure standing at the cost of your own depletion. Truth does not need you to defend it. It stands on its own when you stop shielding what opposes it. And when you stand in that truth without arguing, without persuading, without explaining, you do not merely leave a relationship. You leave a frame of reference in which your worth once depended on someone else's reactions. From that moment on, the narcissist may continue their story. But you are no longer in it, and that is the true ending.